I was born in the United States, but I lived in Hong Kong for many years. My business in Asia was successful and I became rich. After 20 years, I decided to visit my home in New York. On my way from Hong Kong to New York, I stayed 1 week in California. I had a friend who lived in the city of San Francisco, and I wanted to see him again. Dampier had never had a job. His father gave him a little money, so Dampier had never worked. Dampier was a superstitious man. He believed that luck or magic could make things happen in his life. He spent most of his time reading strange books. Most of the books were about occult philosophy. I called them books about magic. As soon as I arrived in San Francisco, I sent a message to Dampier's house. The message said, "I am staying in San Francisco for 3 days. May I visit you?" Dampier surprised me. An hour later, he sent a servant to my hotel with a reply, "Come to my house at once, my dear friend," he wrote. "Come this evening. You'll remember the house, I'm sure. It was my father's home. I live in a tower at one end of the house. You don't have to ring the bell or knock on the door. I'll tell the servants to go to bed, and I'll leave the front door of the tower open. Come up the stairs immediately. I'll be waiting for you. Please come soon." I rode in a cab to Dampier's house that evening. The weather was stormy, a strong wind was blowing, and cold rain was falling. I had forgotten that California is cold and wet in winter. I only remembered the sunshine, not the wind and the rain. Dampier's house was near the Pacific Ocean. It was an ugly 2-story building made of bricks. There was a tower at one end. The house was surrounded by a garden of many trees and beautiful plants, but now it was winter, and there were no leaves on the trees or flowers on the plants. The driver stopped his cab near the tower. Although the front door was only 5 yards away, I became soaked with rain as soon as I stepped out of the cab. I ran to the door of the tower and turned the handle. The door was unlocked, and I opened it. One small lamp burned on the stairway, and it did not give much light. The hall was full of shadows, and I could not see clearly. I climbed the stairs slowly, touching the wall with my fingers. At the top of the stairs, there was another door. I opened it and went into a room that was lit with another small lamp. Dampier came forward, held my hand, and shook it. He was wearing a long silk coat and soft leather slippers on his feet. His clothes were old-fashioned and strange. We looked at each other, and I was shocked. I had not seen Dampier for many years. My friend had changed a lot. He had been a handsome man, but now his hair was gray and his face was very pale. There were many lines around his eyes and mouth. Dampier looked like a thin old man, but he was not older than 50. His large and bright eyes shone strangely in the shadowy room. "Welcome, my friend. Please sit down," he said. Dampier offered me some wine and a cigar, and we talked a little. But I am afraid that our conversation was not very interesting. Meeting friends after many years can be difficult and it can make you sad. Maybe Dampier guessed my thoughts. "Non sum qualis eram. I'm not as I was," he said. I tried to make a joke. "Your Latin hasn't improved," I replied. My friend smiled. "Latin is a dead language, and I'm a dead man," he said. Then his smile disappeared, and he said, "I'll die very soon." I did not know what to say. I smoked my cigar and drank my wine. We were both silent for several minutes. Outside, the wind had stopped blowing. I wanted to leave the house. Suddenly, I heard a strange noise. Tap, tap, tap. It was the sound of someone or something knocking. Was the sound coming from one wall of the tower? Tap, tap, tap. The sound was not quick or loud. It was not the sound of someone knocking loudly on a door. The soft tapping sounded like someone sending a signal, a message. Dampier had forgotten me. He was staring at the wall. There was a strange expression on his face. My friend looked excited and afraid. His eyes shone brightly. I did not know what to do. Should I go or stay? I stood up. I see that you are very tired, I said. I'll leave. May I visit you tomorrow? Dampier turned his head and looked at me. Please stay, he said. There's no problem. Nobody is there. He walked to a small window and opened it. I had not noticed the window earlier. Look, he said. I walked across the room and looked out of the window. I could see nothing except the light of a street lamp and rain falling. No one was standing outside. There was no one near the wall of the tower. Please don't leave me, said Dampier. I must tell you a story. You're the only man that I can tell it to. Will you listen to my story? I wanted to go back to my hotel. Dampier, his house, and the strange noise made me feel uncomfortable. I think that I am a sensible and intelligent man, but I felt unhappy and frightened in that old tower room. However, I did not want to upset my old friend. Very well, I said. I'll stay and listen. Dampier poured me another drink and offered me another cigar. Then he began to tell his story. I didn't move into this house until my father died, Dampier said. That was 10 years ago when I was about 40 years old. When my father died, I got his business, his property, and his money. Before his death, I lived in a large apartment building on Rincon Hill, said Dampier. Maybe you know that area of San Francisco. Rincon Hill was a fashionable area 50 years ago, but now it is run down and neglected. The owner of the apartment building rented out many of its small rooms. The walls of the rooms were thin. You could almost put your hand through them. I was lucky, Dampier went on. The rent was cheap, and I had a large room in the building. No one visited me, and no one disturbed me. I could study my books quietly. I lived happily on Rincon Hill. One morning, as I was leaving the apartment, I saw a young girl, Dampier continued. It was a warm day in June. She was wearing a white dress and a straw hat. There were brightly colored flowers and ribbons around the brim of the hat. Then I saw the girl's face. It's difficult to find words to describe it. Her face was strange and beautiful. I had never seen such a beautiful face before. Without thinking, I lifted my hat and bowed. She looked at me with shining brown eyes, but she didn't speak. I knew that she was pleased to see me, but she didn't smile. She went into the house and shut the door. I stood and stared at the closed door. Would I see her again? Should I speak to her? Would she speak to me? Maybe you think that these are the thoughts of a much younger man, said Dampier, and maybe you're right. But these feelings were new to me. I'd never been in love before. I'd spent too many years with books and too little time with people. Now I believe that you're my only friend. Soon none of this will matter. I don't feel foolish when I talk to you. Dampier stopped speaking for a few moments. Then he went on with his story. Dampier stopped speaking for a few moments. Then he went on with his story. The next day, I waited in my apartment for many hours. I stared out of the window. I watched the street, but the girl didn't come out of the building. I didn't know her name, so I couldn't ask anyone about her. That night, I couldn't sleep. The next morning, I sat by the window again and waited. Then, suddenly, she came out of the apartment building, and I went out too. But when I reached the street, she had disappeared. I didn't see where she had gone, so I walked around the neighborhood. At last, I saw her in a narrow street. We smiled at each other. She recognized me, I'm sure of that. From that time, I often went out when the girl went out. She always wore the straw hat with the brightly colored flowers and ribbons on its brim. I didn't follow her. I simply walked around the neighborhood and hoped to see her again. At last, I went to the landlady of the apartment. "Who is the girl with the pretty face and the straw hat?" I asked her. "She's my niece, sir," the landlady replied. "She's a servant in this house. She lives here because her parents are dead. She works for me." "Oh, my friend, I wish that I'd never heard that piece of information," Dampier said to me. The girl's room was next to mine. She was on the other side of the thin wall.